Those of you who have heard me know that one of my theories is that at this point, Congress acts only when we have what I call a forcing event. A forcing event is an event that makes inaction intolerable. The fiscal cliff was a forcing event. Nobody wanted to throw the country back into recession. And that's why in the middle of December, when it looked like no compromise would be reached, I said on CNBC, don't worry about it, they'll reach a compromise. Nobody wants a recession. Well, we got a compromise, but we were left with 3 dates coming up where Congress had to consider whether to do something. The first I've already mentioned, which was March 1st, when these sequestration spending cuts went into effect. Now, I know you've heard a lot about these cuts. Let me refresh your memory as to how they came about. The genesis of the sequestration cuts was August of 2011. At that point, the United States had hit its debt limit. It had borrowed as much money as it could and moved money around as much as it could after that. And if the debt limit wasn't raised in the next few days, the United States, unable to borrow, would have been unable to pay interest on outstanding debt, and we would have defaulted on all of the U.S. debt outstanding. Now, this was the first time the U.S. had hit its debt limit since the Republicans had taken over the House of Representatives the prior January. And the Republicans said, we are not going to agree to raise the debt ceiling unless the president agrees on major cuts in federal spending. So with the clock ticking, the parties agreed on $2.1 trillion in spending cuts. But they could only identify $900 billion of cuts. And the debt ceiling had to go up. So they raised the debt ceiling, and then they appointed, and this is going to ring a bell, a super committee in Congress to identify the remaining $1.2 trillion in spending cuts. And if somehow that committee couldn't agree, then we would enter a process called sequestration, where the spending cuts would be taken ratably, proportionally across all the government. Half of the cuts, $600 billion, would come from defense, and the remaining $600 billion would come from social programs. Everybody agreed there'd be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid benefits. Well, who would have imagined that super committee somehow just could not reach agreement? It was really impossible to predict. And so sequestration was slated to begin in January 1st, subsequently pushed off till March 1st, and now it has begun. Now, the problem with sequestration is not that we're cutting $1.2 trillion in spending. We can certainly afford to do that. The problem is the way sequestration works, because it allocates the cuts not just evenly across the federal agencies, but down to departments within the agencies and down to spending accounts within those departments. And that robs the head of an agency of the ability to move money from non-essential functions to essential functions. So most importantly, the Secretary of Defense can't move money from projects that aren't going to happen to pay the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Or one you've all read about, the Secretary of Transportation can't take money from non-essential functions to keep the number of same TSA inspectors at the airports. That's the problem with sequestration. Fortunately, some of that problem was solved with the second deadline coming up. Congress had funded the federal government only through March 27th this year. If Congress did not appropriate additional money to run the government, then on March 27th, the federal government would shut down. It would cease to function. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, how would I know it's not functioning? I get it. But fortunately, we don't have to find out because nobody in Washington wanted to shut down the government. And so a week ahead of time, Congress passed a law that extended funding for the government 6 months through September 30th. So we don't have to worry about a government shutdown before September 30th. And the other thing that law did was it gave some of the agency heads, notably the Secretary of Defense, the ability to reallocate the sequestration funds within that agency to essential functions, which is a good thing. We still have sequestration cuts, but they can be reallocated. But that gets us to the third deadline, and it's the most important, and it brings us right back to where we started. And that is the federal government, again, has hit its new debt limit. Congress had authorized the government to borrow $16.4 trillion, and as of the end of last year, it had done so. Congress extended borrowing authority through May 18th of this year, so the government can still borrow. But come May 18th, the federal government will have to start using accounting tricks to move money around without borrowing, and it can probably do so for a couple months. But come the end of July, beginning of August, just like in 2011, that debt ceiling is going to have to get raised, or the federal government will default on all of the debt outstanding. Now listen, we are not going to default on the debt outstanding. It's not going to happen. I said that in 2011, and I'll say it now. It's not going to happen. But we are in for some roller coaster months as we watch Congress debate over how to raise the debt ceiling.